3D printing, but through the lens of supply chain. And, you know, we'll walk through a couple of, what's happening in the marketplace. There's some, I would say there's a lot going on in supply chain overall, but dissecting and where does 3D printing have its place within this. In years past, the global supply chains were so productive and reliable that, they were practically invisible to consumers. I remember the first time that I got my Amazon, it was my 2-day delivery, but it actually arrived the same day. And I was like, how does this happen? And with an understanding everything from the logistics and the software and the components, that everything comes together to make that package come to me so seamlessly. It's really, like I said, it's interesting now that it's come into the forefront of our conversation, general table talk conversation. And the reality is, before the pandemic, it was rarely discussed about these business cycles and how the supply chain actually works. Now that the problem is right here in our face, many of the aspects of our lives have been, I would say, impacted by the supply chain. So we're going to talk a little bit about, everyone's talking about supply chain. Even my mother's talking about it. Like, who's not talking about it? We'll talk about major trends, not only what's happening now, but the future of supply chain, and really looking through that from the eyes of a 3D printing technology. Look, there's bumps in the roads, or high seas, we could say that way, with ships, or canal issues as well. We'll also give a real life example of how 3D printing has helped with the supply chain here in the last 2 years, and then impact today, what we can really take away from this and move forward. So I live in Minneapolis, and there's this great art center called the Walker Art Center. And it was about 5 months ago, and we went to an exhibit. This is a picture of the exhibit. And we walked in, and we were with another couple, and one person said, "Oh, wow, look at all these chairs," but a lot of these chairs are missing the seat. And the wife quickly responded of like, "Well, it must be a supply chain issue." So, I thought it was interesting that, we're even talking about it at art exhibits, even though this is supposed to symbolize, IBM and the blue and the original IBM chair and the deconstruction of IBM and the changes. But immediately we start talking about supply chain and not being able to get those seats. There are plenty of fingers to point when considering how the supply chain has reached this level of crisis. And again, everyone has their opinion, but it really started with the coronavirus outbreak. And then the continuation through stockpiled shipping containers in diverse places, and personnel shortages because of coronavirus, and also just because of the Great Resignation, that it really has been a bit of a snowball for us. But it all ends with the same problem for many companies. And the problem is there's a shortage of vital parts. So fortunately, the tools are already in place for many companies to avoid a lot of these external hiccups in product development that are brought on by supply chain problems. We're going to see like these next generation cloud-based systems and software and additive manufacturing, 3D printing, are really letting companies design and prototype and refine these complex structures on a single platform, and then bring that manufacturing much closer to home. According to, I did some research, looked up some supply chain stats, and according to Hub's Supply Chain Resilience Report, 75% of US-based companies have experienced external disruptions to their manufacturing supply chain in the last year. Now, even though 98% of those companies believe that measures need to be taken to avoid future supply future disruptions, only 63% have actually done something about it. So we have this problem. It's going to persist, and not everyone is acting. And so we'll talk a little bit about today about where does 3D fit into that. You know, I really do believe that 3D printing for the first time is giving executive leaders the power to rethink the relationship with the supply chain and internal operations by really taking a holistic approach to this cross-functional capacity and improving really both the bottom and top line. For example, if there's a supply chain disruption in a traditionally manufactured product, the purchasing team might spend 9 months trying to seek out alternatives. They would have to redesign, perhaps. They would need to look at the new process from scratch. They would need to look at new tooling, minimum orders, molds. Whereas with 3D printing, you could really take that 9, 10, 12-month cycle and could condense it down into a matter of weeks. COVID has created really, I would say, an imbalance. And we'll talk about some of these major trends that we are seeing in the overall supply chain. And this imbalance really is I would say, greatly impacting the overall ecosystem of this, again, very fine-tuned, well-orchestrated, but fragile supply chain that we've had. 12 months ago, we were, getting quotes from vendors that would expire in 90 days. And now, I've seen those, my last company, quotes would expire in 48 hours. And why is that? It's because it was so unknown. We didn't know what was going to happen or if even these parts were going to be available. So our vendors were just so gun shy about putting new pricing around it. It was so volatile for us, and it still is. So, what we're seeing as far as how we have this shift in the supply chain is really planning ahead, whether it's for, a company supply chain or even planning ahead for a weekend getaway with your friends. It isn't so much about knowing what's going to happen. It's about preparing for what could happen. And that's what really happened for us overall, is that the could have happened really did happen. You can't possibly predict the future. I would love to. My 8-ball is still not working quite right, but you can't plan for the probable and the arrangement and making those arrangements accordingly to what could happen. It's no secret that the supply chain tends to be less than predictable. There's been a series of social and economic micro shocks that have radically affected how consumers shop and how they even interact with brands. Think about how you've changed in the last 12 months to 24 months about how you're interacting with your brands. And I would say the consumer experience is going to continue to shift, and supply chains are going to have to shift with it. And these organizations are having to really rethink it. And the ones that are most successful at this are the ones that are adjusting their supply chains in advance of these big coming trends. They're planning ahead, not because they know exactly what's going to happen, but because they know something will happen. And I always think about, what are some of the ways that organizations are planning ahead? And really, 3D printing is a tool in that toolkit that can be used to help with that unknown. It may not be used all the time, but it's a tool that we can pull out, dust off, and use it when it's appropriate and when it's right. I would say one thing I have learned, and one of my dear friends actually runs a global supply chain for one of the computer manufacturers. And so I was asking her a lot about what she's seeing and being really boots on the ground. And one of the things she gave me some great examples. And she said, one of the things that people don't always realize is that there is really this component and raw material mismatch right now in the ecosystem. And the example she gave was body wash. She said, think of you're going to be making body wash, and think of all the items that are required to make this body wash. A manufacturer is going to need labels and the bottles and enough caps. And they may need fragrance to really make this complete finished good. And she said that she read somewhere in the surveys that about 40% of inventories in manufacturing right now is mismatched. So, I mean, they're just like waiting for one small component to be able to finish this off. And so so when I look at that, if the caps are mismatched, is there something that can happen? Are there ways that 3D printing could come in and fill that gap to really help rebalance that ecosystem? And then I would say the last major trend that we're seeing is that last mile. It's going to continue. The micro factories, we're seeing it more and more, especially here in the US. I think this is really interesting where 3D printing can make and will, as the technology grows, a big difference is really changing those business models and being able to do it a just-in-time production instead of mass production. But we need to weigh the cost, right? And it's not there for every case, but when you're looking at this technology and where 3D printing could potentially plug into these microfactories, that is the next major trend, and ultimately getting closer to that customer. When we think ahead, like bigger rocks of what's happening, we're managing the world. We're always going to have barriers that are really complex. There's going to be challenges to, I would say, the executives and professionals of how they're working through their current supply chains or structure based off of these, I would say these three main pillars. But they're used to dealing with big geopolitical and technology and global resourcing and black swan events. But again, what are those next areas that we are likely to continue to see? And what we saw in the last 24 months, the geopolitical environment, we're going to see more of that, where it's going to influence what and where we're actually manufacturing. Sustainability, I absolutely am so thrilled that this is real. With me having two small children, I want to make sure that we are leaving a world for them and their children to be able to flourish. And so when we look around, where does 3D printing fit in sustainability? I think there's a phenomenal business case for it, and really bringing it more local production and reshoring. And then technology, how our technology is going to work together. I mean, we're going to see the integration of different types of technologies, specifically the robots and 3D printing. I mean, we've seen the robots explosion here in the last 12, 24 months. KUKA can't even keep robots on their shelf. But really having that full integration with 3D printing, it was going to be able to take that technology to the next level. So it's not necessarily it's a one-off. It is actually part of that ecosystem and driving, like we said, that getting closer to home, getting closer, from that reshoring and that last mile type configuration. So why 3D printing? I mean, I've said it a couple times already, but the reality is printers can be found at every target in the supply chain right now. But are they being properly utilized? Is everyone aware of it? These are the three things I see where 3D printing can absolutely make a difference in the supply chain. One is, the advantages of additive manufacturing for companies, dealing with any type of supply chain woes, really begins with that digital efficacy and efficiency as well. So not only is it good, but is it also efficient? Your company's products, essentially exist in a software file, right? Until it's sent. This could be sent via the cloud. And then a 3D printer can be located virtually anywhere back to that end customer, as we've been discussing. So guess what? There's no container ship. There's nothing necessary. No ship's going to be stuck in the Suez Canal. So this is, I think, a really interesting trend, and where 3D printing can really make an impact right now today. I mean, we're already seeing it with the military and the utilization of additive manufacturing as well for their own supply chain. The next is really shrinking that distance to the customer. Consumers put, let's say, the manufacturers can eliminate additional cost and logistics by putting that product closer to the consumer. So think about, these micro factories can also be this customized, and it's back to that last mile, like we were saying. Your factory can be located within, much closer to that end user and where the customer lives versus shipping it across, the world. However, again, the price point, that's a huge consideration. Until the price point is there, it doesn't necessarily make sense yet. But with a broken supply chain and the technology, the 3D printing technology improving, we're going to see those areas where it does make sense to use the printing. And then the last piece of it really is, cloud software tools I would say, are letting designers and engineers prototype, iterate, refine these complex, structures. And I just think it's so important that we're going to not waste time and waste material. And that is, again, another area right now where 3D printing can get in really quickly, is that fast iteration. And when time and speed are absolutely critical to be a remedy for the supply chain, and where I would say, not that you're not as worried about the cost, but you have a problem that you need to exercise right now, that's where we're seeing 3D printing win. But the risk, there's so much risk here, right? The global supply chain problems, they're not going away anytime soon. If anything, we're likely to see there's likely to be some relief after the holidays, that many experts think that there will be some normalization of the supply chain, enabling it to catch back up. But the cracks have been shown. The facade is down. We're still aware of it as consumers, and the consumers are going to demand. And so these ecosystems do have to shift to demand. So we need to stop thinking of this as a crisis, and recognize that the world, quite frankly, has changed. And so will the manufacturing model. It will take, let's say, for manufacturers that have the wisdom to see this and see ahead, are the ones who are going to win eventually. Being able to be nimble and be able to be quick are the ones who will be successful on the back end of this, I would say, reinvention of the supply chain. However, for many business leaders, it means rethinking long-standing cost-benefit assumptions. Fortunately, when companies are considering a move towards 3D printing, the product and procurement officers are often even more engaged in the conversation and very excited, because they've been wanting and they've seen this tool for a long time. Engineers and designers spot those advantages and they'll take it. And it'll take a little convincing, because they already know where this technology can fit into enabling. However, it's really that mind shift and getting to those right people. And I would say those cost benefit models, they haven't always played well with the 3D printing, those legacy ones. So I would encourage you, as you're talking about that, you really have to educate and see through the lens of 3D printing, but also understand their point of view of what models they're using currently right now, and making sure that that is aligned. The real challenge with 3D printing tends to come from, quite frankly, the head of manufacturing, who is very cautious about time and money and what it's going to take to overhaul some, quite frankly, fundamental processes in their systems. Fortunately, with recent advances in 3D printing software, it can be much less capital intensive than the previous generations of injection molding and other methods of manufacturing. And that's before cost saving on shipping. And then I also would say that looking at production partners can really help companies get up and running much more quickly at a lower cost than they may think. So I would encourage you, again, when the cost piece of it is going to be something that you will have to work through with those customers. Also, I would say, as materials progress, I would say the readiness will become more important. So, for the real manufacturing leaders, being able to prototype and actually get to that production, even if it's the low volume production, is really going to be critical for them. And they want to know, they want to understand the process, but really trust that the end product meets what they need and what they've been utilizing as well. So definitely a risk, or I say a hurdle you're going to have to overcome there on some of the education. But that's where I say, as the technology improves, as we have access to more materials and resins, and it's going to do nothing but lift the industry up, where some of these risks that were of old past will be really put to bed. Companies that are, I would say, don't really think about the supply chain and are adapting, they're like only 68% have actually done something about it. The other side of it, who aren't doing anything, I would say not embracing 3D printing is a risk. They need to become familiar with it so they know when to pull that tool out of their bag. If they're not familiar with it now, getting them up to speed quickly, they're going to miss the opportunity when there is an opportunity to utilize 3D printing right now in their ecosystems. So I would say those that stick to the old traditional ways of, being left to hope that their ships will come in, well, we've all seen that. Ships might be stuck offshore, waiting to come in for a while. Here COVID hit all of us, and here at Carbon, we did some, I would say, addressing the supply chain right away. And really it came down to, and if everyone rewinds back to almost 2 years ago, that there was this unbelievable shortage of, face shields and masks. I mean, we all remember those photos, right, of the healthcare workers bleeding, and people were sewing masks, and like, what else, what can we do to enable our healthcare workers to protect them and be that front line? And that's where, I would say Carbon really shifted quickly and was agile about addressing some of those needs. And really 2 things came out of it: was the nasal swab. We'll talk a bit about that here in a second. And then also the face shields, and being able to print those very quickly and opening up. I have a quick video I'll show you guys.
At Carbon, our purpose is to improve lives with science, technology, and creativity. When COVID-19 hit and we saw a world confronted by medical supply shortages, we knew we needed to do something. We brought together our employees, partners, and customers to address 2 needs. First, protect healthcare workers. Second, increase testing capacity for COVID-19. Digital light synthesis, our 3D printing technology, is enabling the protection of those on the front lines by making up to 50,000 face shields a week. And more accessible testing thanks to resolution medical lattice swabs, crafted with Carbon technology. Together, we are making what the world needs now.
So again, if you think back,
at Carbon, our purpose is to improve.
If you think back from the concept we had of, okay, there's a shortage of nasal swabs, what can we do? It was literally 20 days to launch. I mean, that's a perfect example of how we were able to really circumvent the supply chain and make immediate impact when it was appropriate. And we had, March 19th, I mean, like March 12th, I remember that day in history, but March 19th was like, okay, there's a swab shortage. One of our engineers was thinking about the lattice structures that we're able to do, and like, how could we potentially do that with the swab? Went through a couple iterations, worked with one of our partners in our network, and was able to bring that and launch with a Class 1 medical device in 20 days. So I'll lead you with this. COVID-19 demanded a significant change from virtually every company in all industries. I mean, this decades-old model of global manufacturing and long-distance supply chains became overextended and, quite frankly, had too many fragile links in the overall structure. Companies embracing innovation will move much faster and will secure more pathways from concept to market. I mean, it's become foundational for these companies and industries, everything from auto to med supply, because the ability to create and iterate these products exclusively on a single platform, cloud-based systems, makes all the difference, and not having to wait for something that literally is out of reach and out of touch. I would say products and procurement teams will definitely appreciate having more control over the work and less reliance on offshore partners. Being agile and speed into the decentralization of manufacturing is the revolution. You have to act fast. You have to know when to act. But if your partners and your customers don't understand the technology that they would have access to, how can they act? So we've got to do a better job as an industry of really educating people on where, I say 3D printing is a potential tool to help relieve some of these constraints of the supply chain overall. I mean, like I said, 3D printing, it's a tool. It's a tool in our bag. It's a powerful one. And we've got to show it. We got to show the value now and not let it be a back office experiment. Now, as the world continues working through this global supply chain issue, 3D printing provides a path forward. It's shrinking the length and reducing the number of links in the supply chain, eliminating many of these logistics snags and costs and shortages and challenges with people and overall manufacturing. And the customer and the companies that are determined to stick with this are going to win. And the ones who don't and go to the old ways, they risk the never-ending series of supply chain problems for the rest of that product cycle. Thank you. I'm going to open it now to questions. Let me see. I've got some questions over here. Hi, Amber. What are the challenges you see in adopting 3D printing to improve supply chain? So, I think we talked a bit about that, right? It's one, it's basic education. Two is knowing where where 3D printing actually works. I mean, we've all read the articles where like 3D printing is going to revolutionize supply chain. It's not. It's going to be a piece of the puzzle to ultimately providing another tool again in their toolkit. I think it's a paradigm is one of the biggest challenges as well. And then understanding those cost models that, again, where does it make sense for 3D printing? Question number 2, do you think there is a shortage of skilled 3D modelers and designers? I mean, I would say we're always working to what can we do to enable that part. And, with me, I would say being of a certain age, I'm not a digital native, but I look at like my children and where they are, like that is going to be part of how they think, and they're already doing that. And so as this next generation comes through, designers, it's really going to be, again, it's just, they're already going to have access to it, but we are in this transition phase right now in the labor force and also with our general labor force challenges. Next question, Amber, what about the challenge of lack of capacity by 3D vendors to support manufacturing production quantities usually needed? Yes, but there's also, I think it has to be like, what is the quantity? I mean, we're seeing high volumes, into the tens of thousands of being printed with some of our partners. So it is capable and it is able. I think it's about what that right product is and making sure you're finding the right partner, whether it's going to be the OEM's going to take it on or if they're going to go through a contract manufacturer. There's several contract manufacturers out there that are able to take on the tens of thousands plus and at a right price point as well. No 3D printing technology can currently keep up with production quantities. It's great research and low quantity situations, but mass production turnaround is not fast enough in current. And that's true. Like I said, it really depends on what it is and if it is that lower volume. And that's where I think this like last mile and more customization, it can lend to there. But we're only going to see, as we said, that the trend of robotics and 3D printing coming together with the speed and really having that true integration, then some of those barriers will be removed. But we are seeing production like in our Adidas midsoles at a really high volume. And one last question. What about the ecological impact? Does 3D printing potentially smaller carbon footprint And believe me, I hate how I sound saying this, give an advantage over traditional manufacturing. Absolutely. And that's just some of the things that as we, and like I said, I can't be more excited that organizations are really understanding how sustainability, now they have to have the responsibility for it, but also for our overall humanity, that 3D printing absolutely can be something, and you'd have to look at the individuals, but overall, the sustainability usually lands on the side of 3D printing versus traditional, especially when you're looking at subtractive type manufacturing. How do you effectively communicate value to clients when you are creating a novel solution to problem and when you don't have competitive products to compare with? I mean, I think you just have to really understand what it goes back to the business and some of those first principles. If you understand their business problem and what they're trying to solve for, you've got to approach it that way. If you're just plugging in a solution without understanding their problem, you're going to have a much harder time. I think about back to some of my oil and gas days even, and it was, I mean, kind of unbelievable what they would be willing to spend on one part. But because production, each time a well is down, the dollars signs are just astronomical. So they're willing to do what they need to do to get that part. So again, really understanding what their economic why is, and then framing it in that point of view is what will help you, like I said, have a more meaningful conversation with those customers or potential partners. Lindsay, it looks like I am like right on the nose of time.
Yes.
I have no other questions. I nailed it on timing.
Great. Awesome presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us. And you guys can catch up with Amber in the networking sessions if you have more questions or want to continue the discussion on supply chain.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Have
so
a great
much.
day.